Thanks, Last Count Corlin. To be helpful to Deputy O'Snoddy, one of the more memorable answers I got to a question on the very same matter in the Dáil when Alan Shatter was Minister as to what was the $2 million the Secret Service actually spent on. He informed me it was a secret. Which maybe the Minister is going to echo that response. But I do think this end-of-year accounting exercise, as it might be presented, is actually quite a fascinating, you might even say eye-watering discussion, in that this is everything. This is all the money that was spent, all the billions that were spent, and some of those that will be spent in January across all government departments, current and capital. And I think it is worth reflecting on a very, very important macroeconomic point, a point of dispute and debate over the last decade or two, or indeed a matter of dispute and debate in what's often called sort of ideological discussion. Namely, what is a legitimate economic strategy? And of course, some people want to pretend there wasn't a crash at all in 2008, that it was all just a bad dream about the bank bailouts of bondholders, of gambling banks, the austerity that followed, and we should just forget about it and imagine it didn't happen. But a much more serious debate would be to ask, have we learned something from the contrast between the approach that was taken in the post-2008 period to an economic crash, cataclysm, and the approach that has been taken in the last year in the face of COVID-19. And it seems to me we really should let that lesson sink in. Because in 2008, faced with an economic cataclysm, we made a decision to bail out the senior bondholders, the global international investors who had financed banks, who'd gambled on property, who crashed the economy, and we asked working people to pay the bill. The consequence was dire hardship and austerity. The long-term legacy was a housing crisis that is still with us, a public health service that is chronically understaffed and that was literally teetering on the brink at the beginning of this pandemic, and which produced a decade-long recession. This time round, under pressure really because the people just wouldn't have taken it again, we made a different decision, which was, to some degree at least, to bail out working people, to support them, to invest additional expenditures in public health services, in housing, and so on. And look at the net effect. Things that we were told were impossible in the period after 2008, that were, quote, fantasy economics. God almighty, I remember that phrase being repeated endlessly. It was fantasy economics for us, as we did in budget submission after budget submission, to propose adjustments upwards in current and capital expenditure for health services and so on, to propose adjustments of 10, 15, 20 billion. And yet, here we have in this appropriation document precisely that. 17 billion additional in expenditure, which we were told was a fantasy before. What was the consequence of it? Well, it sustained the country through an extremely difficult pandemic, which we're still going through, and it produced economic growth. It actually produced economic growth. It didn't produce a decade-long recession, it produced economic growth. And you would think that lesson would be absorbed. You would think people would put up their hands and say, we got it wrong the last time. That approach was a disaster. We made a bad situation worse, and we would learn the lesson of what's happened in the last year. And indeed, there was some there was some rhetoric to that effect from both the previous government and the current government that maybe we would learn the lessons, that we'd learned who was important, who was essential, what was the front line that protected us all, and that COVID might be the springboard for a different type of future where we would now bail out and support the things that really mattered when the chips were down. That we would recognise the critical importance of our frontline health workers, of supporting workers' incomes and jobs when things got tough economically. That was the rhetoric, the new normal. We were not going back to the old normal, we were going forward to the new normal. But it hasn't taken long, in my opinion, Minister, to revert to type. And probably the best example of that, of course, is the health workers. As the applause of March and April fades into memory, what does the government do to reward the frontline healthcare workers? Where was the bonus payment that some countries gave to their healthcare workers for the extraordinary sacrifice and work that they did and are still doing in the face of the pandemic? And of course, that's not past history, because they'll be doing it again in January because of the government's COVID strategy. We'll be facing into further spikes in January, and those frontline healthcare workers will be faced with similar situations in January and February. No bonuses. They're still working free hours with the Croke Park hours. And of course, there's the student nurses and midwives, briefly rewarded with the healthcare assistant pay rate. And then the rug pulled from them in August, in the quiet of the summer. Stop paying the student nurses and midwives. Student nurses and midwives, by the way, who we are going to need again when the almost inevitable spike in COVID-19 comes in January and February, when the infection rates start to climb again among healthcare workers, which are already shockingly high. We'll be needing those student nurses and midwives to hold together our health services, but the government expect them to do it for free. And that is an absolute scandal to my mind. And indeed, it speaks to a longer-term problem, because if there was any real learning of the lessons of the last while, it is that we need permanent increases in the capacity of our health service, which is chronically understaffed and under-resourced. And to do that, to actually achieve that, we would be treating our healthcare workers with the utmost respect, financially rewarding and remunerating for the work that they do, and trying to encourage them not to leave this country, as 71% of those student nurses and midwives are likely to do, because the conditions they have to work in are so poor, because the pay they have to suffer is so poor, because the cost of accommodation is simply out of reach on the salaries that they receive. But it seems those lessons are not learned. And of course, it's particularly worth dwelling on these appropriations because they do include, what did I heard the expression the Taoiseach used, or the Taoiseach this morning, when he referred to those people who come over the hill to Debenhams workers who tell them there's a pot of money that doesn't really exist. Well, here's the pot of money. It's massive. It's an enormous pot of money. But it's a pot of money that includes grossly inflated salaries for Taoiseach, for special advisors, for ministers, for junior ministers, for people earning hundreds of thousands in state agencies. And it also includes the student nurses who get nothing, or who might get a €50 allowance. That's the reality. It's all in here. Or the cost that we bear from an exchequer point of view, something even your IGES report from your department, Minister, has pointed out, the shocking cost of HAPS payments, massively more than if we were delivering public housing directly, and yet we continue to go along that path, and we continue to allow people to be evicted, as some people are going to be over the coming weeks because you've lifted the eviction ban. And when those people are evicted, because of vulture landlords who want to make more profit and raise the rent, they will then come traipsing down to the local authority offices looking for homeless HAP payments, which will cost a hell of a lot more. So It seems that the promise that we were going to learn the existential lessons of the year of COVID for the future have been quickly forgotten as we move towards the beginning of 2021.
Thank you, Deputy.